According to Thomas Patterson, the problem with media covering politics, particularly presidential elections, is they need to discuss politics as a game or a horse race rather than as a clash of ideas. He's not saying this to bash the media, but rather he's saying this because the pressures of using the media to run elections rather than political parties creates a situation where they have to have some kind of excitement, and the game of the horse race is much more exciting than discussing policy. One of the interesting things about studies of campaign promises for presidents is that many times, even against the understanding of people or beliefs of people, presidents do try to keep their campaign promises. However, there is a cynicism many times in the media about campaign promises because they believe that campaign promises are made just in order for people to get elected and not because they necessarily wish to actually put those policies into practice. Finally, also, second, the media often doesn't pay attention to the institutional barriers to keeping promises. Remember that the presidency is only one branch of the government. The Congress has enormous powers, and the president may suggest policies or have their allies in Congress introduce different bills, but the president cannot pass bills. Congress must do that, and because the Congress has so many different interests represented, and oftentimes is not even in the hands of the president, it's difficult for the president to get those bills passed. Similarly, situations can change, and presidents many times will find that, in fact, their promises are no longer relevant or appropriate. Finally, it is, of course, the province of the Supreme Court when someone brings a suit against a particular law to decide whether it is constitutional. And that could also negate part of the president's agenda. For instance, most notably, the Voting Rights Act fairly recently had parts of its provisions negated because the Supreme Court felt they were no longer relevant. Unfortunately, because of that, we now see many laws being passed in different states which actually have the effect of limiting the franchise for people. And the problem that the Biden administration faces is that they have to try to push through the Congress corrections to this in terms of voting rights. And that is a very difficult thing to do. One of the things also that happens for media is when candidates are on the campaign trail. Remember that the fact is that media has to cover an election 24/7. However, when candidates go to different areas during especially the primary season, they will talk about their positions and the things that they wish to do, and they will repeat themselves because the people that they are speaking to at that particular time have not necessarily heard about that position. Well, many times the media will simply say, oh, well, the fact is that the candidate said the same thing that they said before. Many times, unfortunately, constituents and voters will hear that as saying, oh, it's just candidates saying the same old thing. And it makes it seem like they lack ideas, even though the real problem is that the first time that a candidate mentions a policy, it's news, but after that, it's not treated as news. One sees this especially in debates. When you see candidates having a debate, many times afterwards, the media will say, well, they really didn't say anything new. Why one expects a candidate who has been running for president for a long time to suddenly introduce a new policy in the middle of the debate is difficult to understand. What the media person is saying and commenting that they didn't say anything new was that they have heard these things before. The problem is that in many cases, the voters watching a debate have not heard them before. And as a consequence, the response they have is, again, it's just the same old thing coming from politicians, and it turns them off. Also, one of the problems with media in terms of campaigns is they tend to focus upon smaller issues because they have to cover something. Every single day during a presidential campaign is a news day for that campaign. And hence, if they if the candidates are talking about the same policies, the media tends to focus on campaign squabbles or finances or potential scandals and so on. One has to think about this a little bit because it is perfectly natural when you've been in a campaign and you've been together with the same people working to elect a particular candidate almost 24 hours a day. People are going to get irritable and they are going to squabble. They are going to fight with each other, especially over things like strategy. And that is perfectly natural. It's not that the campaign is falling apart. It's not that the campaign is having problems. But the fact is, they do tend to argue with each other. And many times media will make this appear as if the campaign is in trouble, when in fact it isn't. Patterson's whole point is that the media is a miscast institution for running elections. In the presence of weakening political parties, media has moved into the position whereby they provide information and actually end up almost running elections by providing information to voters. The problem is the media is not set to really run an election. First of all, the media can't organize the electorate. That's one of the things that political parties have traditionally done. They get out the vote. They get the people to get excited about voting. Media can't do that. Secondly, news isn't equal to truth. It isn't that news isn't true. It means that news doesn't necessarily tell the entire story because the media searches for a story that's going to interest people rather than a whole reliable picture of the entire campaign. The third problem is that political parties cannot enter into the election until the conventions. That's because they don't have a candidate until the convention. As a result, all of the coverage that happens and information that we receive on the candidates up until the conventions, which are just a few months before the election, are provided by the media. And that vacuum, as it were, can only be filled by scandals and side issues that in many cases have no relevance to the presidential election. The fourth problem is the media takes on the role of kingmaker. Everybody looks to the media to say who's ahead, who's behind, who's winning, who's losing, and so on. The problem is that during a primary campaign, in many ways, there is no winner or loser that you're going to be able to predict at certain times during the campaign. You can't tell someone has actually lost in the primaries until they drop out. The fact is that that process often surprises people. I recall in 2008, the fact was that everyone was saying that John McCain's campaign was over. He couldn't go any further. He ended up being the Republican nominee. 5, the media isn't politically accountable the way the political parties are. If a candidate or a party says one thing one week and then says the opposite the next week, someone is there to call them on it. Someone is there to make that an issue. But in the media, you could have pundits say one thing one week and then it proves to be wrong. They say something the next week. No one remembers. No one holds them accountable. And as a result, people get very confused about what is exactly going on. And if one person watches 1 week and another person watches another week, they end up having different impressions of what is going on politically. Media also can't provide any kind of continuity historically that a party philosophy can. I can assure you that the Republican Party will never come out and say, well, we should nationalize the oil industry. Or the Democratic Party will never come out and say, we should do away with Social Security and just make it private. But the fact is, the media can make all different kinds of statements about the candidates, and as a result, many times the candidates can make different kinds of statements and get away with it because the media doesn't have to be consistent in covering them. Media also sometimes tends to get candidates to promise more than they can deliver. And that's because, again, they have to make headlines. Don't make headlines by saying that the policy repeated over and over again that they want to push is going to get them into the news. So they try to promise something new. And then that forces them to overpromise what they can do. And finally, journalistic values and political values conflict. Political values are supposed to represent one side. Journalistic values are supposed to be unbiased. And that also tends to confuse constituents and voters. The problem here is one of schemas. The media sees elections in terms of a game schema, a horse race. Everything, therefore, is defined in strategic terms. Candidates don't advance a policy because they think it's good for the country. They promise something to win their constituencies' votes, at least according to the media. So if someone says, well, a candidate says, I want to expand Social Security, the media interprets that as they're trying to go for the senior citizen vote. If they say, I want to do away with student debt for college, well, they're going for the college student and young people vote. But the fact is, they just may be stating those things quite simply because they think it's good policy. The media isn't being cynical here, but if you see things in terms of a game, you see actions by the candidates in terms of strategies. Citizens see elections or need to see elections in terms of a governing schema. They want to know if Smith and Jones are running, how much better off am I going to be if Smith wins as opposed to if Jones wins? Which candidates have certain stances on issues? Which ones can actually get those policies through? And that's how citizens want to make a choice that's best for the country. Again, the media isn't trying to deliberately deprive citizens. It's just that they are trying to meet their own demands for policies and their own demands for ratings, and therefore they make it into a game. As I said, who's ahead, who's behind, how are things going, here is today's poll, and so on. That can be an interesting part of covering an election, but it is not the information that citizens need in order to know how to make a decision in voting. Why has this happened? Well, there have been many kinds of changes since the 1960s, and that has been one of the things that has happened. First of all, political parties are weaker than they were before, and someone has to fill that vacuum. Secondly, parties are not involved in primary campaigns. The fact was that parties used to select candidates at the conventions in a real rough and tumble type of process. Many times you didn't know who the candidate would be going into the party convention. Now we have primaries and caucuses, and the people decide who is going to be the candidate. And as a result, the parties are less involved. Secondly, news has become more interpretation and less reporting, and candidates therefore get less time to speak for themselves. We hear from candidates in sound bites, and many times, unfortunately, the fact is that the person whose soundbite is better is the person whose voice is heard. This was particularly true in 2016 when Donald Trump used to say a lot of pretty outrageous things, and it would be covered in the news because it was outrageous and drew attention, and none of the other candidates in the primaries were heard from. And finally, Candidates now use polls to find out which issues are really going to motivate people, even if it isn't what the public wants to talk about. In the 1988 presidential election, the Republicans found out that they could really make people dislike Michael Dukakis, the Democratic nominee, by talking about his stance on whether teachers should be forced to lead students in the Pledge of Allegiance and his stance on crime. The problem was that what the people were really concerned about, the public was concerned about, were things like relations with the Soviet Union, the deficit, unemployment, and so on. But those issues get pushed to the side. And the polls are used to find out what the candidates want to talk about, and the media tends to follow suit. The result is that the media has the power to shape political choices, but they don't use it in order to advance certain partisan ends, as much as people believe otherwise. The so-called mainstream media tries its best to remain unbiased and objective. But the problem is that they are governed by an economic structure, including a 24/7 news cycle, a need to compete with internet sites, uh, Instagram, uh, Twitter, TikTok, and the need to keep an audience. And as such, political choices are shaped by the needs of the media in order to remain competitive and to make money, not the needs of the electorate. As I said, it is not Patterson's desire here to bash the media. It is to say that it is unsuited to run elections.